Hi, I'm Zachary Hunter, and welcome to the Explain It to Me podcast. EITM Pod is about info without gatekeeping and encouraging curiosity, community, and education without drowning in jargon. This is part 3 of my mini-series about the X-Men. In this episode, we're going to look at what are the major eras and most important core stories about Marvel's merry band of mutants. First, however, would you do me a favor? Would you please like, rate, and subscribe to EITM Pod so that this show can continue to grow and that the algorithms let people find it? Thanks. Your help means a lot to me. Okay, here's how this is going to go. This episode is more about eras and key stories / events in those eras. In part 4, I'll get into more standalone stories / runs in the spin-offs to consider reading, along with other resources to check out. I'm going to focus on the core X-Men books. So X-Men, which became Uncanny, also adjectiveless X-Men, and one brief mention of Astonishing. These are the books that either headlined or co-headlined the franchise. This will include crossover events, but arcs only focused on in the spin-offs will be discussed next episode. Okay. So, obviously, any list of eras / stories about the X-Men begins with Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Kirby started checking out between issues 12 and 17, with Stan Lee leaving after number 19. These issues set up the core ideas of the series. And if you want the so-called Silver Age version of the original 5 X-Men, the 05, here's where you go. After that, the series is largely guided by a writer named Roy Thomas. There are some intriguing stories here, including introductions of characters like Havoc and Polaris. But for the most part, there's a reason the Silver Age X-Men is mostly remembered through nostalgic retellings, like X-Men Season 1, or the time-displaced 05 in the 2010s, which I'll get to, but not based on the actual stories that led to the series' cancellation. This now brings us to the over 16-year run, the first run, of Chris Claremont as lead writer of the X-Men. Issue-wise, that's X-Men 94, back when Uncanny didn't use the adjective, through Uncanny X-Men 279, and also adjectiveless X-Men, numbers 1 through 3. For the sake of this video, I think his first run breaks down into 4 major sections. I'll call them the early days, the masterpiece era, highway to hell, and the end of an era. Okay, so how did Claremont begin? This era seems to begin at X-Men 94, which picks up right after Giant Size X-Men number 1 by Len Wein and Dave Cockrum. The later, Dave Cockrum, continued on as main artist for this early era of Claremont. And I'm ending it at issue 128. 128 is the finale of the Proteus story, starring a villain of that name and Dr. Moira McTaggart, who becomes a much bigger deal in more recent issues. This era establishes what for many is the definitive characterization of Nightcrawler and Colossus, and the earliest developments of Storm and Wolverine into the legendary characters they became. This is the all-new, all-different team. This era introduces the Phoenix, not to be confused with the Dark Phoenix, which I'm placing in the next phase of the run, what I'm calling Claremont's masterpiece era. Phoenix here is also rather different from anything that came later, especially what came about in Grant Morrison's new X-Men run, which I'll get to much later. This early days era is when Claremont first brings back Magneto as part of his long-term plan to make the Master of Magnetism the complicated and fully formed character Magnus, aka Eric Lehnsherr, aka Max Eisenhart, became. And then comes the masterpiece era. It begins with the story that made X-Men what it was, and in many ways influences everything that comes after. That is to say, the Dark Phoenix saga, issues 129 through 138. Putting aside everything else for the moment, this is the arc that for the first time has none of the O5 officially left on the team at the end of the story. This epic story turns the page on the X-Men in a way that is hard to understate. Following that arc, there's the two-parter Days of Future Past in issues 141 and 142. Then there's the Brood saga, which includes also two X-Men vs. Dracula stories in issues 154 through 167, plus the Uncanny X-Men Annual number 6. And then, starting in issue 168, the creative team of Claremont plus Paul Smith, as the main artist, begins what is broadly called the From the Ashes storyline, which continues until issue 176. During this time, the God Loves, Man Kills graphic novel, with art by Brent Eric Anderson, slides right in. Arguably after issue 168, because Kitty Pryde is there. And also between issues 168 and 172, there was the original Wolverine miniseries, which Claremont did with Frank Miller, and is sometimes called the Wolverine in Japan story. That is the basis of some of the second Hugh Jackman movie, The Wolverine. But all told, these side stories are also written by Chris Claremont and contribute to this masterpiece reputation of this era. In fact, during this period, in spinning out of the Brood saga, New Mutants launched, first as a graphic novel similar to God Loves Man Kills, but then as a solo series, which was also written by Chris Claremont until its 55th issue, when he left to launch Excalibur and the first regular/ongoing Wolverine solo series. Basically, this masterpiece era is an extraordinarily productive time, with even miniseries like Magic, with a K, not a C, which is about Colossus' sister Ileana, and is actually set between panels of issue 160, though it was not released until after issue 179. It's a seminal and beautiful story. It's also brutal. But the X Office was so hot back then that even colleagues of Claremont, like Dave Cockrum and Nocenti, were creating the first-rate Nightcrawler and the legendary Longshot miniseries, respectively, at this same time. And after stories like these, it seems there'd be a period of Claremont catching his breath, but also beginning to set up his next round of stories. I think the best way to describe this next round is to move on and describe what I'm calling the Highway to Hell era. And while a lot happens in the meantime, this period really kicks off in issue number 210, and the launch of the Mutant Massacre. Mutant Massacre in 1986 was the first crossover event for the X-Books. It focused on X-Men and X-Factor, specifically issues 210 through 213, and issues 9 through 11 respectively. Now what's X-Factor? X-Factor at this point was written by Louise Simonson, aka Wheezy, after its very rocky start under Bob Layton. X-Factor in this iteration was a series that brought together the O5, the founding members of the X-Men, back together, including a recently resurrected Jean Grey, much to Claremont's chagrin. And this was a team book that, along with Power Pack, which Wheezy also was writing, Thor issues 373 and 374, written by her husband Walter Simonson, and Claremont's New Mutants number 46, those issues all interacted with Uncanny X-Men to such success that these crossovers became yearly events in the X-Office. And of all these annual crossovers that came after, the Fall of the Mutants is pivotal. Fall of the Mutants led to the series Excalibur for Kitty Pryde and Nightcrawler, and the so-called Outback era for the rest of the Uncanny X-Men lineup. Basically, the X-Men seemingly die, and this leads to the creation of Excalibur, but also the further isolation of the X-Factor team from the rest of the cast, who are now hiding out in the Australian outback. This isolation specifically leads to Madeline, aka Maddie Pryor, and Cyclops. She was with the X-Men in the Outback, and he was with the rest of the O5 on X Factor. They were married at this time, which that isolation obviously caused some issues, but it also, this isolation leads to the drama that is the non-New Mutants part of the last and biggest event of this era, the one it all builds towards, Inferno. I called this the Highway to Hell era, and in Inferno, due to both what Maddie got up to in Uncanny, and Magic with a K, aka Colossus's kid sister, did in New Mutants, there were literal demons taking over New York City. This is mostly by them possessing objects like mailboxes, and also in the case of a tie-in issue with Daredevil, there's a terrific fight between Daredevil and a demonic vacuum cleaner. It's crazy and awesome. But overall, Inferno wraps up plots that had been building for dozens, if not hundreds, of issues across the various Mutant comics and miniseries. It ended in August of 1989, and in August 91, Claremont was off the books for the first time. So, that brings us to what I'm calling the end of an era. These last two storylines of note that Claremont was involved in were Extinction Agenda in late 1990, which focused on the apartheid allegory / fictional country of Genosha, and summer of 91's Muir Island Saga, Muir M-U-I-R, in which Claremont left in the middle of. Extinction Agenda, X-Tinction, Extinction Agenda, transitioned New Mutants into X-Force. And for the X-Men, it ended the, quote, no official team, end quote, era that sort of followed their time in the Outback. The Muir Island Saga, on the other hand, changed X Factor from the older version with the O5 into a US government-sponsored team headed by Cyclops' brother Alex, codenamed Havoc, spelled with a K. That era of X Factor was largely written by Peter David, which he later followed up years later in X Factor Volume 3, aka X Factor Investigations. More on that next episode. But this abrupt departure was obviously not Claremont's goal. The X-Books had already teased an arc called the Mutant Wars. But instead of it, Claremont left the franchise, and Fabian Nicieza and Scott Lobdell, as writers, picked up the baton before going in another direction. At this time also, the artists that had been co-plotting the final issues of Uncanny and Adjectiveless X-Men under Claremont, besides Claremont with Claremont, and actually had taken over New Mutants from Wheezy, namely Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld, were already leaving Marvel for greener pastures, aka their own company. This upheaval left Nicieza and Lobdell without long-term master plans, or established artists that were so popular that in case of Rob Liefeld, he appeared in a Gap clothing commercial, essentially selling jeans. These departures, under the pen of Nicieza and Lobdell, led to Executioner's Song, X-Qutioners, which focused on Cable, a Wheezy and Liefeld co-creation, and Strife, who was Cable's biggest opponent other than Apocalypse. it is full of ties to X Factor stories, especially their part of Inferno, and plenty of New Mutant stories as well. But to some extent, and fair play to them, Nicieza and Lobdell are trying to play the hits. Indeed, there was finally a 30th anniversary of X-Men in 1993, which, based on scheduling, included issue 25 for both X-Force and Adjectiveless X-Men, and alongside various other issues across the X-Books, Excalibur and the like. I'm ending this end of an era here because, as the cover of Adjectiveless X-Men 25 says, it covers the, quote, death of a dream, presumably Xavier's. In that story, infamously, Magneto, who at this time stopped being the complicated character Claremont had developed, but rather reverting to an evil madman like in the 1960s, rips the metal out of Wolverine's body. Magneto then gets taken off the board in a way that viewers of the X-Men 97 cartoon will now know well. I think, given Claremont's departure from these books, pencilers who drew the best-selling American comics ever, X-Men 1 and X-Force 1, and then departed to form Image Comics without Claremont, and this laying low of Marvel's biggest hero, not named Spider-Man, and the removal of Magneto, the biggest X-Men antagonist, from the storylines for almost 4 years, seems like it certainly ends not just Claremont's era, but also that of the first 3 decades of X-Men, even though Lobdell and Nicieza were writing it at that time. And after this, there are many important storylines, many of which are written by Scott Lobdell, who I must say has a controversial reputation. For example, he wrote the first 28 issues of Generation X, a beloved book by its fans. And besides Executioner's Song and Fatal Attractions, he also guided the Phalanx Covenant, Onslaught, and Operation Zero Tolerance events, along with, most importantly, the Age of Apocalypse. Of all these events, Age of Apocalypse is likely the event I would recommend checking out from this period, as it is both the most standalone. Legion Quests sets it up, but it's standalone. And more thematically, the way X-Men went afterwards, especially in terms of the style of artwork, most notably by Chris Bachalo. Other than that, while there are a few comics involving Cyclops and Jean Grey/Phoenix that I will definitely be discussing in the next episode, this as a whole was very much it was the best of times and the worst of times era, depending on how you feel about mid-90s comics, the effects of the Marvel bankruptcy, and I think fair to say confusing/meandering plots, such as Crimson Dawn, involving Angel and Psylocke, and The 12, which is an Apocalypse-related story. The worst part of this era was that it served as the end of both Excalibur and X Factor. Neither of these books were what they had began as, nor in the case of X Factor was it even what it had become after the Muir Island saga. But as creditors closed in on Marvel Comics, the curtain fell on 2 beloved and distinctive spin-offs among the X-Books. So, then what happened? Well, I think 4 names sum it up well. Chuck, Grant, Chris, and Joss. Chuck Austen wrote Uncanny X-Men 410 through 443. He took over from a very clever writer named Joe Casey. Grant Morrison took over Adjectiveless X-Men by actually renaming it New X-Men at issue 114. Prior to the renaming, Adjective X-Men at issue 100 brought back Chris Claremont to the franchise after having issue 3 be his last one previously. And we can't talk about Joss Whedon until we deal with the others. So let's start with the second Claremont period. Claremont's return is not beloved like his original run. As you can tell with Morrison taking over Adjectiveless/New X-Men a year later, Claremont bounces around the franchise, partly due to issues people had with his later run, and issues people had with other people's run that he would come in and arguably fix. In the coming years, Claremont told stories that likely would have been different if Wheezy or someone of Simonson's influence was still editing him the way she had done before her own writing was able to be recognized. By the way, if you see the name Louise Jones as an old X-Men writer in the comics, that's Wheezy. Her name changed when she married Walter Simonson. Anyway, Chris Claremont in the early 2000s and the years to come knew the stories he wanted to tell. But he did not always play nice in the sandbox regarding how other writers treated the characters he had developed for years. This was particularly the case with Grant Morrison's treatment of Magneto, and somewhat with how Kitty Pryde developed in later Excalibur stories, such as under Warren Ellis's Excalibur run. Now for Chuck Austin. Chuck Austin, so I should say this. Other than some Claremont comeback issues, this was my first regular experience reading X-Men. So I want to be fair to both writers. Chuck Austin, unlike Chris Claremont in the comeback, didn't have the same goodwill from prior work. Austin was very much working without a net. So, a lot of fans would say he wrote 3 of the most derided, controversial, and or hated stories mainline X books ever published. Holy War, The Draco, Draco, and She Lies with Angels, which are Uncanny 423 and 425, 428 through 434, and 437 through 441, respectively. But also, he wrote some of the best storytelling/characterization Polaris or Juggernaut had ever had. Basically, he swung for the fences, Chuck Austin. And while he is not beloved by X fans, nobody, I believe, can fairly say he didn't try to provide fascinating, entertaining stories with touching moments regarding dealing with child abuse and mental illness, but also controversial stories that took years to deal with. Claremont took over Uncanny again from Austin issue 444. And then there was Grant Morrison. If you're unfamiliar with their work, imagine Lex Luthor. So a bald genius, but instead of being focused on making billions and destroying Superman, imagine if he used his abilities to write some of the most creative comics ever composed. Over several arcs, Morrison wrote a singular story that renegotiated and redefined what the X-Men were and what they could be. As I mentioned in the last video, this run introduces Quentin Quire, Cassandra Nova, and not just the definitive version of Emma Frost for many, especially those who didn't read that Gen X, but also the one that can assume her, quote, living diamond, end quote, form. Morrison's New X-Men run is a genius piece of writing that made a lot of people very angry. So much so that Chuck Austen, far from everyone's cup of tea, replaced Morrison writing New X-Men in issue 155. Before that title switched back to adjectiveless 2 issues later. And Claremont immediately undid most of what Morrison had done regarding Magneto in Excalibur Volume 3, issue number 1, released just 2 months after Morrison left New X-Men. So Claremont and Austen replaced uh, Morrison. Claremont replaced Austen. Yeah, there was a lot going on. But what followed Morrison's run in a more direct follow-up slash sequel way, at least thematically, is the run on a series called Astonishing X-Men, written by Joss Whedon of Buffy, Angel, and Firefly fame, and allegations of toxic abuse of workplace infamy. And this channel is not a place to litigate Whedon or his work. But that first arc, Gifted, apologies, which is issues 1 through 6 of Astonishing X-Men Volume 3, was seen as tremendously influential at the time. Astonishing and the Gifted arc is tonally quite different, though, than the Morrison run it supposedly succeeds. So, after this era of writer focused runs, the X Men begin to change its focus. These were storylines and periods like Utopia, Schism, and M Day / Decimation, the later of which I discussed in the last video regarding Scarlet Witch. These books went through years of debate between characters, like the so-called schism between Wolverine and Cyclops, the fight between Cable and a character named Bishop over the fate of the child mutant messiah named Hope, and also the fight between corporate / editorial and creatives post decimation about what the franchise is and how it should operate, given the movie's success. This was an area where team philosophy, the mutant metaphor, and even the physical location / setting of the story were very much up for grabs. It asked a lot of questions. However, it didn't answer many of them. There's some good comics there. Jason Aaron wrote Wolverine and the X-Men. After the schism, magic became a much bigger deal. The character, not the concept. But X-Men in the mid-2010s was very much wandering in the wilderness. And this was the time-displaced 05, under writer Brian Michael Bendis, re-entered the franchise. These wilderness years, of which Battle of the Atom is a noteworthy story regarding the 05 and their time travel related shenanigans, largely ended with 3 series / events: Extermination by Ed Brisson, X-Men Disassembled under Matthew Rosenberg, and Age of X-Men under various artists. Extermination resolved the 05 storyline, along with some other events I won't spoil. Disassembled and Age of X-Men, on the other hand, were intriguing, though quite bleak comics, which passed the time until the next big change. A change once described as the island that walks like a man, aka the island of Krakoa. The Krakoan Age was launched by Jonathan Hickman's miniseries House of X and Powers of 10, 2 interlocking miniseries. And it ended just weeks ago, at the time of recording, with X-Men 700, aka X-Men Volume 6, number 35. There is so much you can say about this era, and a few of the runs will be mentioned in the next episode, pretty much for sure. But both it and this new era called From the Ashes that just launched with Jed MacKay's and Ryan Stegman's Volume 7, X-Men number 1, seem intended to bring new readers on, or for old readers to come back after being away for years or even decades. So, as the comics have often said since Kitty Pryde has joined the team, welcome to the X-Men. Hope you survived the experience. Okay, that was a lot. I hope it gives you some guidance on the history of the core parts of the X-Men franchise. I will discuss major parts of the spin-offs in the next episode, along with other key standalone stories and helpful resources that you can use to learn more about the X-Men if you're so interested. I do hope you come back for part 4 and everything I have planned for after that. And so you don't miss out, please subscribe. If it's on YouTube, click the notifications so we can grow EITM. And if you could, tell your friends about the show. In the meantime, though, if you have any questions or suggestions for future topics, I can be reached at eitmpod@gmail.com. And if you're willing to help the show monetarily, it'd be much appreciated. And you can go to ko-fi.com/EITMpod. That's kofi.com/EITMpod. So until next time, please stay safe out there. God bless, and thanks for your time.